I think so.
Welcome, everyone. I'm Kathy Newcomer, and I'm the director of the Trachtenberg School of Public Policy and Public Administration here at GW. And I'm here to welcome you and say I'm really happy you're here, and to apologize about the heat. We have had some issues with not only this building, with other buildings. Yesterday we got the thing saying we may have to cancel all classes in Phillips Hall because it's too hot. So things happen. You just never know. And so I'm sorry. But at least we have these nice holders that you can fan yourself with. Yeah. So we can't really have big fans in the room because there are a lot of people that are listening to this online. And so that would be difficult for them to hear. And they like to listen and ask questions and so on. So welcome to our series. Just to remind you that we are hosting the series with REI Systems, provide an opportunity in the grants management environment to talk with one another, to hear about extremely important issues that are in the grants management community, and to facilitate dialogue. And so we've had several really good ones. Our next one on November 8th, I believe it is. Anyway, we'll get that. We'll remind you that, November 10th. And one of the things that we're going to do, along with a team of researchers, we actually have put together a survey for the grants management community that you may be receiving. And if you don't, you can ask, I'll say I want to participate, to get a feeling of where people are. There's been so many interesting things. Like uniform guidance, the GONE Act, the DATA Act. A lot of things affect your work. And we're really interested in trying to put together sort of taking the temperature of the grants management community, so to speak, and once a year. And so I just thought I'd bring that up. We are delighted today. We've been asking, we thought it would be good to have somebody from OMB to help just field questions, kind of tell you where they are, in terms of what's going on, but also to field questions. And I'm going to turn to my partner in crime here with putting together these sessions, Jeff Meyer, who is a principal at REI Systems, and so he's going to introduce our speaker. And again, thank you for coming in. Again, I'm sorry it's hot, but we're happy you're here. Jeff.
Thank you, Kathy. So I wanted to first kind of describe why these exist. And they exist really because we thought there was not a really strong and cohesive community around grant making. Lots of folks share ideas with each other about how to seek grants or how to avoid having your grant taken away because you're non-compliant. But frankly, more than 20% of the federal government's discretionary funding is dedicated towards achieving agency missions through grants. And we want to try and create an opportunity for you to interact and learn from each other. So actually, in fact, as Kathy says, a lot of the opportunity here is not just to learn from the speaker and the topic at hand, but actually to learn from each other's experience. I would like to encourage you to ask questions as the presentation goes on, and perhaps to ask questions of Ms. Hubbard, our presenter, but also to ask questions of each other and to kind of network both before and after the event. I also want to just briefly introduce REI. REI does kind of three different things around grants. We help a lot of agencies, 8 or 10 major agencies, with their grant-making systems and processes, and those range from HRSA to the Department of Health Resources and Services Administration, to the Department of Energy, to the the Small Business Administration, to the Department of Homeland Security. We also help improve grant-making processes for agencies such as NASA, and in some cases for non-federal agencies. So for the Patient-Centered Outcomes Research Institute, which gets some federal money but essentially makes health grants, as well as for the District of Columbia Department of Health. We believe, though, that this is something that is a situation where, of course, our knowledge and our expertise is not sufficient. So we think that you need to kind of get to know each other and learn from each other more so. And that's actually one of the reasons why we wanted to try and initiate the survey that Kathy described. And I want to emphasize that we really feel strongly about your participating. And there are kind of three reasons for the survey in our mind. One is to help get the grant community to inform presidential transition and to say, here are the highest priorities for transition from our perspective as grant makers. And the second is really to kind of set up a baseline and to say, as Kathy suggests, over a series of years, what have been the big challenges, what have been the big successes for the grant-making community this year, and how do they change and evolve over time so that we can kind of understand where are things heading in the right direction, where are people concerned about what they're heading, and how can we improve those. And again, to provide a more cohesive basis for research as well as for informing you. And that makes kind of the third point, which is the survey will help you understand not just kind of where you sit on the island of your own agency or your own department, but see where you stand and perhaps give you a better basis to tell, for example, others in your agency or your OMB resource management office as you seek funding. Look, here's how we stack up in comparison to kind of the larger group of peers, and we're doing really well in this area. And nobody really knew exactly how well we're doing, but now we'll have this basis to be able to understand ourselves where we need to improve and where we can tout our successes. So we're hoping, again, that not only will you respond to the survey that's going to come out in about 2 weeks or so, but that you'll encourage your peers and you'll forward it on to your peers. It is being co-sponsored by the Association of Government Accountants and the National Grants Management Association. It's something that we will, on November 10th, as Kathy suggested, be sharing with you the results of that, and we'll share those, of course, electronically, but we'll have a nice discussion panel as well on November 10th, so you can kind of hear about it and ask questions too. So I hope you'll come, put that on your calendar and come as well. You'll get, if you're here, unless you say, I never want to hear from you all again, if you're here, you'll get an invitation to that formally about 3 weeks in advance, and then another reminder maybe a week in advance. But let me step back and introduce our speaker today, Rhea Hubbard. She's a policy analyst at OMB within the Office of Federal Financial Management. And OFFM, of course, focuses on helping both set and improve financial policy and improve financial management policy government-wide. So she really does have a broad purview and focuses heavily on grants. And not surprisingly, Rhea had a great career working both with the National Institutes of Health and EPA in the grants arena. So she's got experience both kind of as a practitioner and now kind of in the policy and evaluative arena. She holds a master's degree in public policy from a competitor, American University, but nevertheless, I'm sure we'll hear that she's pleased to be here at GWU, as well as an undergraduate degree from the University of Missouri. Likes to garden and read, but I have suspicions that she may be preoccupied because she's a new mom with a 16-month-old son, which may not leave as much time for reading as you might imagine. So Rhea's going to offer a little bit of an overview of emerging priorities in federal grants management, and again, I would encourage you to think of questions both for her and perhaps for each other. And with that, let me ask Rhea if she'll come up and take the stage.
All right, so thanks, Jeff. And again, please feel free to ask questions or provide any comments that you have throughout the presentation. I really want this to be a discussion. Again, I'm not the one. Actually, it's funny because the topic is emerging priorities, but really it's the community that drives the emerging priorities. I kind of am going to be presenting it from an OMB perspective, kind of what we've heard from the community from our perspective as we're implementing some guidance, but really I feel like it's the community that drives where we're going to be heading in grants management. So, all right, so Jeff appropriately highlighted that 20% of discretionary spending is actually in grants, and this just kind of shows you how much grant spending has increased over time. What is kind of surprising about this particular graphic is that you would expect in 2009 for there to be a spike and we'd be going down after 2009 in grants management, because what happened in 2009 was ARA. And I think many of us in the grants community didn't think that we'd ever see this much grant funding again, but as you can see, it's actually still continued to rise. So I think that is because the federal government truly relies on grant recipients to further the program missions, and we don't really see grants going away. It still continues to go in an upward trajectory. I'd also like to mention that states, approximately 25% of our budgets actually rely on grant funding. Universities is also a very high proportion, so there really are institutions out there that rely on federal dollars to. So again, what does this funding support? You all know this, but grant funding supports all types of activities. There are over 28 federal awarding agencies, and we're actually learning more and more about other agencies that have grant programs, believe it or not. But there are 28 probably primary players in the grants community, and they support all types of activities. This is just a few examples. This is a water treatment plant funded by EPA. Head Start obviously receives a lot of funding from the Department of Education. This is just to highlight that the Department of Homeland Security provides a lot of federal emergency management funding, and this is some recent pictures of some of the flooding that's happening in Louisiana. PBS Kids, those who have kids, I'm focused on this a little bit more now than I was before perhaps, but the Department of Education actually provides a lot of funding for a lot of the children content that you see on PBS and their Ready to Learn program. And this should be familiar to most of you. This is the Arlington Memorial Bridge. As you've seen in the news, it needs a lot of repair. In fact, if these repairs don't happen, the bridge would actually be shut down and closed to only foot traffic. They recently received a $90 million grant from the Department of Transportation Fast Lane program. Yes.
So Head Start, I thought, is from HHS, not the
Oh, I'm sorry. Yes, you're right. HHS.
Because
Apologies.
they're from HHS.
Yes, you're right. Apologies. Okay, so before we get into a lot of my presentation will really be based on where we're headed after the uniform guidance, just to make sure everyone's on the same level playing field. What is the uniform guidance? This is the guidance that applies to federal financial assistance more broadly. It largely focuses on grants and cooperative agreements, but it also some of the provisions actually apply to loans and other types of financial assistance. And this guidance delivered on the Obama administration's his first term directives, which I'll be talking about a little bit more later. And the goal really was to better target financial risk and better direct resources that ultimately lead to better program outcomes. So that's what we're really about, is better program outcomes. It was published in December 2013, on December 26, December 2013, and it became effective almost 2 years ago in December 2014. And that's when 28 federal awarding agencies formally adopted it in Title II for it to become effective. And so here's just a brief timeline of grants reform. Again, I mentioned that the uniform guidance was largely in response to some presidential directives. Specifically, there was a memo in February 2011 on administrative flexibility and lowering cost for better results for state, local, and tribal governments. And that kind of started this effort. The emphasis was to reduce unnecessary burden and redirect resources to services that are essential to achieving better outcomes. So in October 2011, the Council of Financial Assistance Reform was established. And this council comprises of the 8 largest grant-making agencies and 1 small agency representative. Initially, when the COFAR was established, it was NSF that was a small agency representative, and it is currently the Department of State. The idea is that they would provide more of an international foreign perspective. But obviously, even though there are only 9 agencies represented at the COFAR, we actively engage with the other agencies. There's a Financial Assistance Committee on eGov that we regularly meet with and talk about the COFAR priorities and solicit feedback from that Financial Assistance Committee and e-Government Committee. But largely it's the COFAR that really drove the uniform guidance. In February 2012, there's notice of proposed rulemaking. Then we had the proposed guidance in February 2013, and the guidance became final in December 2013. So that's just kind of the timeline.
Right.
Yes.
Can I ask, one of the things that I think people might be interested in at this stage with the new administration coming into office in a number of months, are things likely to change again? I wonder whether or not you can offer any perspective on kind of what was the motivation behind the decision we need uniform guidance? Was it reduced risk or make analytics easier across agencies? Can you tell us anything about or offer any insight into kind of why was uniform guidance adopted in 2013?
Yeah, and I'm going to go into more of the specific major policy reforms, but I think again what kind of really instigated a lot for it to actually happen was these presidential directives in February 2011 and various activities. Mind you, it's been talked about for a long time, I think, this idea of one, circular, you've heard the term super circular. This has been talked about a lot in the grants community, there's a need for consistency. Previously we had 8 OMB circulars and now it's on one place. So just from that perspective, it's better for the recipients and also for the federal awarding agencies. But again, I'll go through more of the policy, some of the major policy reforms. So once the guidance became final, our work didn't end. We hosted a lot of spring and summer training, webcast. We published a single audit compliance supplement. And then again, in December 2014 was when the agencies actually formally adopted the uniform guidance. And then we've also been in the process of collecting baseline metrics. And we continue to go to forums like this and various events just to talk about the uniform guidance and getting the word out about the new changes. So this is just kind of a graphic demonstrating how previously there were 8 OMB circulars where all this guidance was located, and now it's been consolidated into one. Before, if you were a federal awarding agency, you had to know which circular applied to states versus which circulars applied to universities, et cetera. So it was actually confusing. There was a lot of similarities, I'd say, between the circulars, but also there was some nuances, and you had to know the difference between those different circulars. So one of the greatest benefits of the uniform guidance is that it eliminated a lot of this duplication, and it's an all-in-one place. You know where you can go for the guidance. So I've already talked about how it eliminated duplicative and conflicting guidance. Just some stats on this, the amount of regulations that this actually eliminated. So when the 28 agencies adopted the uniform guidance in December 2014, we actually went through and saw all the other regulations that were eliminated as agencies adoptions, because before the agencies would adopt the circulars and their regs, and there would be these separate regulations with perhaps some deviations to the OMB circulars, but it'd all be a separate part of the Code of Federal Regulations. We went through and saw what agencies actually eliminated, and we determined that it was approximately a 75% reduction in regulations is what ended up happening if you actually did a page count of all the regulations that were deleted. So it was a 75% reduction in regulations. So you can imagine what that means to recipients, so they don't have to go to all these different places in the Code of Federal Regulations to find out what rules apply to them, depending on what grant they have. And remember that a lot of recipients receive grants from multiple federal awarding agencies. And just a reminder, every agency's adoption now can be found in Title II. So their adoption of the uniform guidance is in Title II. Another major driver of why we did this policy to begin with is that we really wanted to include provisions to focus on performance over compliance. And this is kind of a continual struggle that we have as a grants community, I'd say, is that the focus is often on getting the awards out the door, complying with the requirements and terms and conditions of the award, but really what we need to be focusing more is the performance of the actual awards. Are we achieving the outcomes that we intended to achieve with these grants? So there were a lot of provisions in the uniform guidance that were aimed to help agencies think more about this. Specifically, there's a specific provision in uniform guidance in 200, Section 102, that allows agencies to actually come to OMB for deviations, if they're interested in deviations to uniform guidance, if they have an innovative program design that is intended to improve cost effectiveness and improve collaboration across agencies. So again, agencies can come to us for a deviation if they need a deviation, if there's anything in the uniform guidance that's kind of holding them back and they would like to have a more innovative program design to achieve better outcomes. There's also provision for fixed amount of awards in there, which is something that a lot of agencies I think are interested in. There's some signaling to blended and braiding of funding and how you could use even funding across from different agencies into one grant, or even within an agency for several different programs into one grant, and that's beneficial to the recipient community because they only have to manage one award, and then the focus is just on the outcomes rather than the specific compliance with each individual award. There's also provisions in there to encourage the efficient use of information technology and shared services. And this is from more of, I'd say, a recipient perspective. There's requirements in there that they have internal controls to help protect sensitive data, that they must avoid duplicative purchases, and it also encourages shared goods and services across the organization. Obviously, there are provisions in there to provide consistent, transparent treatment of costs. Specifically, we signal mostly to the requirement that agencies must accept federally negotiated indirect cost rate agreements. That is a change from previous guidance. And this is very important to the recipient community because indirect costs are real, and it really does hurt them when they cannot fully recover their indirect costs. There are specific requirements in there that federal awarding agencies respect those agreements. It also requires that pass-through entities as well do this for their sub-award recipients. It also limits allowable costs to make best use of federal resources. Another major area is that we set standard business process using data definitions, which I see this as an area that continues in the grants community, specifically with the Data Act and other efforts that are going on. But with the uniform guidance, we actually standardized 99 common data definitions in the guidance itself, which was a great accomplishment, because traditionally grants communities always use different terminology for certain things, and we continue to do so. There is more work that is needed in this area, I would say, but there's at least 99 common data definitions for guidance. There are also requirements for what is required when you issue a federal award. There are certain standard data elements that are required to be on those awards. Previously, there wasn't. There's also requirements what is included in notice of funding opportunities. There's also some provisions in there to encourage non-federal entities to have family-friendly policies. Obviously, there are some provisions to help strengthen oversight. Again, a strong emphasis on internal controls. There's also a requirement that agencies review risk prior to making an award. And then there are some changes to single audit requirements to target them on risk of waste, fraud, and abuse. We actually raised the single audit threshold to $750,000, which still provides 99% of the coverage of federal dollars spent. So although that reduced burden for approximately, we estimate about 5,000 recipients, we still have 99% coverage on the single audit. So there's still 99% of the federal dollars being audited. So I just went through a lot of major policy reforms. I just want to make sure that there's no questions regarding some of the major changes with the uniform guidance. No? All right. So where are we nearly 2 years later? As I mentioned, the guidance was effective December 2014. So that means that we're almost 2 years into implementation. Right now, we're really focused, the focus is obvious on implementation. We are working with agencies to collect the second set of metrics currently. And we've actually collected all of that data, but we haven't made it public yet, but it should be public soon on the COFAR website, which is cfo.gov/COFAR. There's a link to it later in the presentation, but those metrics should be available soon. So we're focused on agency implementation, and this is just a screenshot of what you can see if you went to Title II and the Electronic Code of Federal Regulations. This is where you'd see each agency's adoption of the uniform guidance. Specifically, if they have any deviations from the guidance, you'd see that here.
May I interject? For those of you who are interested, the presentation, raised presentations on REI's website as well as I think GWU's website. So if you want to follow these links, you can do so fairly easily without having to write them all down.
Yes. But so here's the link again to the COFAR website. On the website, there's a lot of great resources. If you haven't checked out the COFAR website, please do so. This is where you'll find, although I mentioned all of the agencies' adoptions of the uniform guidance is on 2 CFR, you can actually see we have a helpful PDF on the site that actually goes through each agency's adoption and what the different exceptions are. There are also a lot of great FAQs on the site that we continue to update. I think we're planning on making an update relatively soon. The point is that it's supposed to be a living document, and we will continue to update it as we get a lot of questions. We also have some great training webcasts on the site. And again, the metrics will be published on the site very soon. And this specifically for the federal audience, there's actually some great 101 training modules now that have been posted on the website. There are 3 modules posted now. So please check it out if you haven't. We're trying to encourage everyone to check out these trainings. And so we have 3 modules now, and we actually plan on posting 2 additional modules. The next 2 modules will be on the cost principles will be module 4, and module 5 will be discussing risk management and single audit. That'll be the focus of module 5.
Rhea?
Yeah.
So during implementation, it's surprising how many issues we're able to get resolved. Are there any unresolved issues that are still swirling around the implementation of the uniform guidance that are kind of still in play?
So, I mean, just interpretation, I'd say, is the largest challenge we have right now. Is we're getting a lot of questions still regarding what certain provisions mean, what do we mean by that? So again, that's kind of the focus of the FAQs. That's the purpose of that document, is to help with that. I think, and something I was planning on talking about later too, is that we struggle because, Dale, you're very informed, but we're getting the grant specialist who's in region, I don't know, 8 of a certain age, how do they know about the uniform guidance? Like, I think that's one of the challenges that we have right now, is that we need to make sure that our workforce is fully informed regarding the uniform guidance. Also, the recipient community, make sure that they're fully informed. We still hear from a lot of subrecipients. I'd say we primarily hear from subrecipients, which a lot of the subrecipients are actually nonprofits. And they keep on coming back to us and saying that their pass-through entities are not appropriately interpreting the uniform guidance, or they don't even know what the uniform guidance is. So I think it's like a matter of getting the word out, clarifying areas of misinterpretation, and making sure that the workforce is really fully informed. I think those are some of the major areas that I'm seeing. And I'm also curious, because that's what I see from my perspective. I kind of, I sit in OB. Is there anything else anyone else is seeing on the ground regarding challenges of uniform guidance implementation? No?
Well, there was just one issue about micro-purchasing at the universities,
Yeah.
and I think you all have come to kind of an agreement on how that's going to play out. Or
Yeah, so we continue to hear from some in the recipient community that there are certain provisions in the uniform guidance that have been difficult to implement. And I think any future changes to uniform guidance would be based on data. So I think we're considering all of that. Maybe there's some unintended consequences that we weren't fully aware of when we finalized some of the provisions. Anything else that folks have heard on the ground? No? Right. And just a reminder that there's a lot of great resources and tools out there. There's this breakfast forum, which is a great resource for the grants community. There's also, NCURA has a lot of great information out there, NGMA, AICPA, ECFS. A lot of organizations have a lot of great resources and tools out there. We're also really focusing and trying to explore areas of best practice. Again, we've been focusing on training that I just mentioned. And a lot of the best practice areas that we're looking at is like, well, what are some best practices in terms of pre-award? For instance, what are agencies doing during this requirement of their risk assessment? How are agencies implementing that new requirement? Post-award, there's emphasis on internal controls. What recipient organizations are really doing a really good job at that, and then obviously audit. And speaking of areas of best practice, we just recently posted a webcast that kind of highlights some of the promising practices that we've seen with uniform guidance implementation. So please check that out. Again, it's on the COFAR website, and here's a direct link to the actual webcast. So unfortunately, I cannot show you the results of the metrics, but again, just continue to monitor the COFAR website. But here are some of the uniform guidance metrics that we're collecting from the agencies. We're looking at the number of OMB approved information collections, and where we would like to actually, ideally we'd see this metric is going down again. So remember, in the uniform guidance, there is this emphasis on data standardization and how agencies should be using common forms. We should be collecting similar information. So we would ideally like to see the number of information collections go down. And when I say information collections, I just want to make sure that everyone understands me. We're talking about the forms that you receive from recipients, or when you're, you have the federal financial report form, or you have a progress report form. We're talking about all those different forms, all those information collections that you're receiving from recipients. We're also looking at the number of fixed amount awards issued. Again, this is a specific provision introduced in uniform guidance allowing agencies to use fixed amount awards. And again, ideally, we'd like to see this metric go up because, again, these type of awards, the focus is on performance, not on compliance as much, and it introduces a lot of flexibilities for the recipients. And also, it makes it easier for federal workers to manage specific awards. We're also looking at the number of agency exceptions to indirect cost rate agreements by CFDA, which is the Code of Federal Domestic Assistance listing. And this is just to get more at, or when agencies are making exceptions when they're not honoring the indirect cost rate agreement, one, are they being transparent about it? It should be in their CFDA listing, but ideally, again, we'd like to see that go down unless there's a statutory reason that they cannot accept the indirect cost rate agreement. Number of ICR agreements issued by agencies. This is just more of a baseline just to understand the landscape of how many indirect cost rate agreements are issued. And that is related specifically to this, this next metric, which is the extensions of ICR agreements issued. The Uniform Guidance introduced a provision where a non-federal entity may request an extension to their indirect cost rate agreement for up to 3 years, I believe. And this is really beneficial both for the federal awarding agency and the recipient, because it actually, to get an indirect cost rate agreement negotiated is actually very burdensome and costly, and this is a really helpful provision to those institutions that maybe don't have the capacity to negotiate their indirect cost rate agreements. So again, we'd like to see that, ideally that number, we would see that going up. And then the new awards issued by fiscal year is really just a matter of, again, a baseline, just to understand how many awards are being issued. So some current priorities, as I mentioned earlier, we're kind of, any future changes to Title II of the Code of Federal Regulations would kind of be focused on data, areas that we've heard there's, maybe there are some unintended consequences. So if we were if we were considering future changes to the Code of Federal Regulations, it would be based on data. And there is some consideration right now on the Council of Financial Systems Reform and OMB. All I can really say about that is monitor the Federal Register. And also any other future changes, one on data, and also to respond to new statutory requirements. As was mentioned earlier, there's actually been a lot of new statutes that impact the grants management community. One of them is there was amendments to the requirements associated with FAPIS, which is the Federal Awardee Performance Integrity Information System. There were some amendments in the NDA 2013 that the grants community hasn't implemented yet, and that's specifically the non-federal entity has to provide who their predecessor or successors are, like their corporate relationships. So when you're looking at past performance matters, you'd be able to see whether, for instance, their parent company had any problems. So there's some requirements associated with that. There's a Never Contract with the Enemy Act, which really, it actually applies to a very small subset of grants. It applies specifically to foreign grants that occur in enemy combatant zones, but it still impacts the grants community. We need to respond to that. And then there's also the GONE Act, which I don't mention here, but that wouldn't particularly have implications for the uniform guidance necessarily, but it certainly has strong implications for the federal grants community as they're closing out their awards. So again, any future changes in uniform guidance would be based on statutory requirements that we haven't been responsive to just yet because uniform guidance was finalized before these statutes came along, or just to address areas where we've received additional data. Yes?
Is there a list of countries that fall into that Never Contract with the Enemy?
It depends on what the active, it could change. It's like over time. It depends on what DOD classifies as an active combatant zone. So I think like Afghanistan.
Would DOD have like a list, like an active list that they change all the time, or is that just like a run by your Office of General Counsel thing?
Yeah, so again, we haven't fully implemented those requirements yet, but I think those will certainly be some of the implementation questions that arise when we actually get into that, yeah. But I do believe that, again, this is not my area of expertise, but DOD, I think, probably does have a list of what those zones are. I'm just not sure exactly where it is yet. Yes.
One of the things that the whole discussion, from trying to get the guidance to be uniform to FAPIS, makes me think is the uniformity allows federal agencies to more easily learn from each other. And if I take an example from the private sector where I as an individual interact, my credit information goes to the credit reporting agencies. And of course, when I'm applying for new credit, the creditor pulls my credit report and looks at it. But as well, if I, for example, fall behind on payment of one credit card, that information actually goes out to other creditors at the same time. And I'm wondering if there's any sort of similar kind of analytic proactive capability that are in place or being considered in the government. So that, for example, if 2 or 3 different agencies make grants to the same recipient, and again, that recipient's not just starting to apply for a grant, but is having problems with one during the course of it, might there be some sort of proactive push notification to other agencies to say, you know, hey, you're at larger risk than perhaps you thought you were. So we can take advantage of this because we've got more consistent information with the Data Act and more uniformity with the uniform guidance. Is there any sort of initiative like that that would assist agencies in managing their risk that can take advantage of the standards?
So I guess we're getting closer to that, I'd say. Like, we hear that a lot from the community. Like, wouldn't it be great if we could see how one recipient is performing for this agency and not our agency, or even within an agency. Sometimes within an agency, the program management staff or the grants management staff doesn't know how they're performing in another award. So I think things like FAPIS get us closer to that, but there's not a specific, I'd say, initiative for that purpose. But FAPIS certainly does get to that, in that if your award is terminated for failure to non-comply, it is reported to that system, and every federal awarding agency must check that system before making
Before a new award?
Yes, exactly.
But not so much for a continuing?
No, yeah. Now, I guess an agency could choose, as part of their internal controls or overall like risk management, like anytime they, for instance, look at an active award annually, like some agencies look at the award annually for performance, they could theoretically be checking FAPIS, like if they chose to do so, but that's not a requirement in uniform guidance, but that's something the agency does. I mean, they have it at their disposal, they could check FAPIS. Yeah. Any other questions?
To build on this discussion, so you mentioned Data Act, risk management, and I suspect enterprise risk management is a broader notion that OMB is pushing these days, and shared services. How do you see those 3 interplay in the grant space going forward next couple of years?
Well, I think I've heard from the community, and is that there is a need, for instance, of sharing this information across agencies. So I do think that is definitely an area that we may see in the future. I cannot predict where we will be in 2 years, particularly at this moment in time in the administration. But I certainly think that as the transition teams come in and they hear from the federal awarding agencies and from OMB and from others and from the community, from the recipient community as well, that there is this need. I can't imagine they wouldn't hear that there's this, need to share this data across the agencies better. Does that kind of get to your?
I appreciate it.
Yeah, but I can't,
Can I make a quick plug? You're members of the grants community, and you have, I think, proactive, you're more proactive than many. You may find that you meet with transition teams or help contribute to transition books. It's okay for you to say, hey, I think this should exist. And I'll make it even a more brazen plug. If you write in our survey, there's some open response opportunities. I would like to see this or that. One of the purposes of the survey is to inform the transition. And if there are a lot of folks that respond to the survey and a lot of folks that write that in, that might get some attention.
So also some of the current priorities. So although we are at a unique position in time that I don't know what the next administration will specifically be taking on, but we still have a lot of priorities to be accomplished in the next several weeks. We're still focusing on the council financial assistance reform priorities, which actually go through FY17. They actually go beyond this year. And some of the things that the COFAR is looking at is continue along a lot of the themes that we mentioned doing from guidance, and that's data standardization, which we just kind of touched on a little bit. The grants workforce, we've been thinking a lot about the grants workforce and how there's a need for some sort of long-term vision or government-wide solution to the grants management workforce, because what agencies are doing now is really, either one, they don't have a program or they're relying on private training providers, or some agencies there are no requirements for the federal grants workforce. We're also looking at single audit analytics, how to use that data better. But again, more information on the COFAR priorities is actually on the COFAR website, so please check that out. But we do continue to work towards those priorities, yes.
So there are some certifications, for example, of course, for CPAs and to a certain extent for procurement officials. If some fine academic institution were to identify and establish kind of a certification or credentialing program to train grant makers, do you think the government would be interested? And I'm thinking about a specific fine academic institution that we're being hosted by at the moment.
Yeah, I mean, so that's maybe. I guess my response would be certainly some agencies already rely on private training providers. So I assume some agencies would be interested in that certification. But right now, there's no government-wide requirement for certification.
Right.
So and that would have to be an O&B policy call actually. Like we would have to actually issue policy requiring that, you know, each grants management specialist must have this certain level of baseline knowledge. Do they have to have a degree for it? You know, I don't know, but along the lines of how you think of procurement, how they do it. Yeah. Mhm. Yes.
Hi. So I'm just curious, I am a new grants officer representative for the Department of State, and I know that in order to manage any sort of grants, you have to go through at least PY 220, like there's a set amount of trainings you have to do. Is that not for all agencies?
No.
Okay.
No.
Okay, I didn't know that.
Yeah. So yeah, we're familiar with Department of State's program. They've actually briefed the COFAR on their program. But yeah, that's not a government-wide requirement. So part of the challenge is that if you as a grants officer from the Department of State, you have to have a certain level of training and knowledge. If you go to another agency, they may not have that same requirement, or maybe it's maybe it's additional requirements. Maybe you have to take additional training to be at the same level. So it is a little bit, it's a challenge, especially because we know how much we move as the federal employees as well between agencies. Yes.
I think that the first step would be each agency being required to have a process,
Right.
a warranting process that then has those requirements. And then how it's worked so far is each agency then meets those needs individually. Because if you think about the acquisition community, that is a lot of infrastructure built up for instituting a codified approach. And COFAR and Uniform Guidance have only really been around in a consolidated way since 2014. So it seems like baseline would be mandating that a process or requirements exist, and then seeing what type of infrastructure, because that costs money, would be required at a federal-wide level to implement.
Yeah. No, I think that's definitely one way to approach it. Yeah. I'm great. This is great because I was going to talk more about grants workforce later, so this is great. And obviously, we're focusing. There's been a lot of focus in the grants community just because it impacts the grants community so much. Is on Data Act implementation. There's been a tremendous amount of work on that. So I just acknowledgement that that's obviously a very high priority right now. There's also the Section 5 pilot under the Data Act, which is being managed by HHS on behalf of O&B, and they're looking at several different test models to measure to the extent certain things reduce recipient burden. That was a requirement in the Data Act is a pilot to determine what areas we could reduce recipient burden. So that's obviously an ongoing, that's of interest to the community. And I can talk a little bit more about that if anyone has questions around the Section 5 pilot. That might be a great future forum topic, actually. And then obviously new statutory requirements that I've already talked about. We continue to have new statutory requirements. There are actually a lot of proposed bills out there right now that impact the grants community as well. So there's the Grant Act that is kind of occasionally gets interest, and then I don't know, and that's one of the acts that's kind of happening right now. But lots of areas. We're seeing more and more too in the National Defense Authorization Act, which is traditionally where you see a lot of the procurement requirements. You traditionally see a lot of requirements that affect the FAR there. We can kind of continue to see the insertion of requirements that apply to grants as well.
Yeah, this question may come out of left field, but with our American Reinvestment Recovery and Reinvestment Act, one of the explicit congressional interests was in job creation.
Mm-hmm.
And I wonder whether or not, for example, although a lot of other kind of innovation and research grants made by a variety of agencies are towards basic research, I wonder whether or not that's also a kind of a potential trend of looking to see not just kind of what's the proximate outcome, well, that research project succeeded or failed, but looking kind of at a longer-term ultimate outcome. You know, did that research project get commercialized, create jobs? And will there be that sort of kind of performance interest either on behalf of Congress or OMB or, you know, perhaps individual agencies? Do you see?
Not specific. So yeah, not specifically like in the context of research. Have I heard any interest about, you know, what extent did this commercialize and create jobs? But I have seen. So there's also the Taxpayer Right to Know Act that's and that actually includes a provision that would require the number of FTEs supported under grants. So there is interest. There is interest in knowing how many, how many jobs. I guess that would kind of be, exactly.
By the grant money.
Mhm, yeah.
Yeah, but not the multiple of what the innovation eventually produced.
Right. And under ARA, that was a requirement to report as well as the number of FTEs that were funded with ARA funding. So it's kind of similar.
I mean, I think back to some extent, you know, DARPA, the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, made grants that kind of started the internet, and to a certain extent, the internet's a pretty good thing economically. But I'm not sure we ever kind of bring that back as credit to the agencies who kind of help run those grants.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great point. And also, there's also been a lot of interest in open source recently about how we hear there are certain agencies that are considering open source policies as they apply to their grants. They require anything that's produced on your grant to be open source.
Question here.
Yes.
Sure. When you look at the uniform guidelines, the applicability section, it talks about it's being applied towards non-federal agencies, right? But when you look down again, it talks about defines non-federal agencies as all that except for profit and foreign organizations.
Yeah.
So where do they fit in? I mean, how do we apply these?
So each agency chose the extent that they would adopt the uniform guidance to for-profit and foreign. So depending on your agency in their adoption, they may have applied it to for-profit or foreign. Because that's kind of the answer. We continue to receive questions in regards to that. So and we hear from the non-federal recipients as well about how there's a need, we've heard from the community, to make it more consistent on the applicability of for-profit and foreign, because it makes it difficult when you are a pass-through entity giving out a subaward. So we have heard that there's a need for that. So I wouldn't be surprised if that was kind of a future area that's explored further. But right now, the way it stands is it kind of depends on how your agency adopted the uniform guidance. To my knowledge, almost every agency that mentions it in their adoption did apply it to foreign, except for USAID. I don't think that they say a specific unique programmatic mission. They didn't want to apply it to the foreign, but almost every other agency did. I know a lot of agencies applied it to for-profits as well. Okay, so what's ahead? So this slide could be a lot bigger. Like, we could take up a whole wall space of all these different future areas that we could explore, like thinking of, a lot of it. Specifically, we can think of uniform guidance as a foundational framework. But I just tried to bucket this a little bit and kind of what I'm hearing a little bit, or we're hearing at OMB. We continue to hear about implementation, the need for consistent implementation, workforce, and we need to train our workforce. Standardized business processes and data, we continue to hear about that. Particularly from the recipient community, there's a lot of frustration, I'd say, that we've heard in the recipient community about how there's no streamlined reporting. I recently was on a call actually last week, and this is interesting. I was talking with someone who works a lot with their tribes. It's a federal awarding agency, and they said that they estimate one of their tribes has to learn over 200 systems to report on their federal grants. Like, that's how many systems they interact with. I don't know. I don't have the data in front of me, but that's what I heard verbally. I said, "Give me that data," was my response. But can you imagine a tribe? I mean, tribes are actually really low. They traditionally have high turnover. They don't have as much capacity as a lot of our other recipients. But imagine a tribe has to learn over 200 systems in order to report and comply with the terms and conditions of their grant. That's pretty unbelievable. So we hear a lot from the community about there's this need for one place or even just a few places you could go to report on your grants. So that continues to be an area. Obviously, performance over compliance is another big area, and the need for innovative program designs. And just like, a lot of this is actually already happening. It has been happening for years, but I think it just continues to gain traction. So for instance, there's the performance partnership pilots, which is the Department of Education. It allows interagency funding for one grant for a specific outcome for disconnected youth. So like that's kind of an interesting pilot that's happening right now. That's kind of an active area. There's also the Promise Zone initiative, which I'm not sure to the extent some of you are familiar. But there's this idea that the federal government would come in to a community and kind of use all these different funding streams to like actually achieve better outcomes for the community, which is really exciting because agencies, as you all know, sometimes we work in our silos. We're very focused on our specific program and what we want to achieve for our specific program, but really it's about that community and what outcome you can achieve for that community. So there was actually a recently issued memo, OMB memo on the Promise Zone initiative. Is actually issued on Friday, so check that out. I don't have the reference to it, but I'm sure if you Google it, you can find it if you want to learn more about some of these initiatives that are happening. Any
Yeah.
questions? Yeah.
I was going to say, can you flip back to the
Yeah,
last
sure.
one for just a moment? So I don't know when it was, 30 or 40 years ago, the single audit was kind of passed with a groundswell, and essentially it took congressional legislation. And the motivation was, why do we give enough money to hire auditors, do 5 different audits of a single recipient because they get money from 5 different agencies? That's stupid, it's a waste of money, let's have a single audit. To some extent, the kind of the streamlined reporting in the different systems strikes me as a deal. It would call for a lot of coordination between agencies, probably would require at least OMB, if not congressional action. But similarly, it seems to me like, the number of different, whether it be accounting systems and softwares, or whether it be the kind of the expertise required of your staff, could be dramatically reduced for the recipients if there were kind of a single reporting requirement.
Yep.
Do you think that's going to happen anytime soon, or is that 30 years in the future?
Yeah. Yeah. Okay, so I hear a lot of interest on it. This idea of a one-stop is what we call it, the one-stop place you can go and do all your post-award reporting. There's a lot of interest. I cannot predict, again, what's going to happen, but again, I think we're kind of also at a unique opportunity as a community that if folks think that this is an area that is really important, that they let their voices be heard. But yeah, I mean, I think there's interest. I hope it's not 30 years down the road. Let's just say that, yeah. I hope it's.
I mean, I'd like to make a similar plug here, which is the folks who have a real strong interest in that are clearly recipients. But there are so many of them, and they are so diffuse and so geographically dispersed, it may be unlikely that their voices really get heard. And I think that you all as grant makers have louder voices because you've got the money, and there are fewer of you, and you're closer to the federal power centers. And ultimately, kind of what's in it for you is that perhaps instead of, let's pretend, 3% of the grants you make go to this reporting burden, maybe 0.5% could. So you would get some bang for the buck. And I suspect, again, that the grant recipients are just never going to have the critical mass to kind of lobby and cause it to happen, but you might be able to.
Jeff, are you talking broader than single audit, or are you talking?
I'm talking not single audit, but in this case, reporting.
Program and progress reporting.
Yeah.
Financial reporting.
Financial reporting and a variety of other things that are compliance reporting. Eventually it could be like for college, there's a kind of a single application for financial assistance across all colleges, kind of federally coordinated. Perhaps there could be a kind of a similar sort of more uniformity brought into grant applications.
I certainly think there's a lot more that could be done at the federal level, although given that our missions are come out of Congress with very specific requirements, you're always going to have differences that are inherent to the type of work that's getting done based on where it came from.
I agree with that, but what would have to happen is there would have to be some kind of uniformity enforced upon Congress. So no one in Congress right now dreams that they can call for a unique audit based on the grant program their appropriations subcommittee is funding, because they recognize that's wasteful. And similarly, I think in the example with the tribes, those tribes, I suspect, are not facing 200 different systems for a single grant. My bet is they've got a bunch of grants, perhaps from several different agencies, and that's why they're facing the 200. And it's, I think, for that reason, perhaps not a problem that can be solved by a single agency, but that does require some coordination across government. But again, with a big benefit for the recipient, and I would suggest also maybe a constructive and valuable benefit for the grantor agency as well.
Yeah,
So fix that,
yeah.
Rhea.
Yeah, I hear what Dale's saying, which is there's often there's specific statutory requirements for programs that I think where we could get where there's room for improvement in the grants management community is that we could at least determine what is the core business process that is standard and what, like, for instance, federal financial report, that's everyone receives that. So we also, to get to the place where you have this one stop, you also need more standardization across the federal government, right? Yeah. Yes.
And I think there is a push to move towards that. I don't know if anyone here is from AOPE, they could speak on that better, but I know that there's a lot in the federal community. There's like this form, they're having a lot of these where like the payment management system, PMS, having everyone with that EIN number, that unique identification number across all like grants. And I think that way you have like standardized financial reporting, or I don't know if it's financial, but at least expenditure reporting. So I know there are pushes in that direction. I don't know if these conversations aren't happening at the same time.
Those certainly happen, and also part of the single audit, the Section 5 pilot under the Data Act, that is actually one of the areas we're looking at, is the streamlined federal financial reporting through payment management system.
Right.
The challenge is not every agency uses the payment management system,
But aren't
right?
they supposed
So,
to?
No, no.
Oh, no? Okay.
so I mean, again, there's the actual internal federal government community probably needs to standardize more as well in order for it to really impact the recipients in a meaningful way, I'd say.
Rhea, we have about 20 folks who are listening online or viewing, and they aren't as easily able to hear the audience questions. Would you maybe repeat the question the audience asks so that the folks online can hear it before you
Sure.
answer? Thanks.
All right. Okay.
Yeah, to build on the innovation part, we keep thinking about grants as monetary grants, but I think Jeff talked a little bit about the open source, the code, the RFIs, the know-how that government can potentially transfer. How much of that is a focus of discussions these days?
So, I mean, certainly, I guess when I've talked about open source, always it's been from a context of what is produced under a grant, should it be open source? Like, that's kind of the context that, but yes, I think your point that recipients could actually learn from a lot of the open source activities that are actually happening at the federal level right now, like where there's this push that any, and you're probably more familiar than I am because you're at GSA, but that the any customized software that is produced by the U.S. government must be, well, a certain percentage of it must be open source now. So it's actually, it'll be posted, available, online and available, that any, for instance, if a state government wanted to use that open source code for their purposes, they could. So, I mean, yeah, I think there's some great opportunities there. And I apologize for not repeating that specific question. I will try to remember next time. All right. So we've already talked through this one a little bit, but just kind of, I just wanted to highlight kind of some of the areas where I think there may be some future work. Again, acknowledging that I cannot say what exactly the future holds, but I think this is definitely an area that we've heard from the community. Again, as discussed, there's no consistent standards for qualifying people to perform grants management function, and there's no government-wide requirement. So the theory is that there's a great opportunity here because if you get a stronger workforce, it would obviously address a lot of the management challenges that agencies are experiencing. It would help manage risk. It would help ensure consistent interpretation of the uniform guidance, which is, again, one of the areas that we, we're still working through because the uniform guidance is so new. It would also increase the knowledge of innovative program designs that focus on performance over compliance. We hear a lot from, I guess, from the recipient community maybe, and the federal government community about how there's this lack of knowledge that you can do things differently. Like you could design your program to be a little different to make it more effective. Like, there is an opportunity to do that, but I think we just need to do a better job of letting the grants community know about that. And to be thinking creatively when you're putting together your notice of funding opportunity announcement and things like that, how you can design your programs. Recognizing that there are sometimes very specific statutory limitations, so you always have to do it within that framework. So again, I don't know if folks want to talk about workforce development anymore, but I think this is definitely an area that would be a future interest of the community. Yes, Barbara?
Yeah, Rhea, on this one, and this is part of it, but succession planning.
Yeah.
And I know that workforce development and getting a standard thing would help with that, but I'm looking more at recruiting people to go into the grants management field. They know the opportunities there for contract management, and so they jump at the phone for that one, but grants management, oh, it's just money, we give it away, we don't have to do anything. And so that's why I get 250 grants that I have to manage,
Yeah.
that I'm the manager for. So is there any thought on that kind of thing in here?
I think Barbara's point was on succession planning and how one of the challenges that you see is recruiting the grants workforce,
Right.
because there's this perception that there's not opportunity because there's no there's no specific career track that you could go on, whether it's procurement.
Right.
And yes, yes, that has been discussed in the context of workforce development, although it's not reflected on these slides. That's definitely an area that we've talked a lot about, is that there's this need to professionalize the workforce and for folks to know that it's an opportunity and there's a clear career path. Also, what's funny is that who in the room knew that they were going to go to grants management, just out of curiosity? Did anyone graduate from college or think they're going to go to grants management? No one? Yeah, no, neither did I. Like, I don't think, you do hear about contracts and you hear a little bit about grants when I was getting my public policy degree at the competitor nearby, but there was never like talk about that as a career path. You just most of us stumble upon it, right? But it is such an important role. Over 20% of discretionary spending goes towards grants. It really, a lot of the roads you drive on, a lot of the water infrastructure, it's impacted by grant funding, so it's really important. Yeah.
So one of the things that might be interesting to raise visibility of the profession and maybe even attract some people who consciously want to go into it would be some sort of awards to say, here are the 3 top grant makers in the federal government this year. And again, it seems like that would have to be something that would be government-wide. Perhaps an individual agency wouldn't be credible, but perhaps OMB might. Is that something OMB might consider doing?
Everything's up for consideration. But no, that's a great idea. Yeah, the top grant makers. Yeah.
And with the data-driven sort of interest, maybe it could even be data-based. So it's who's objectively been most successful or most improved or what have you.
Barbara?
Yeah, just going back to what Jeff had said originally about getting some type of university program going for certification, doing that. This is one of the areas that I've gone to several different universities, and I'm not from this area, so it's doing that. No, this is in West Virginia.
No,
And doing that, and they very proudly stand up and say, we teach you how to write the grant, we teach our people how to implement the grant, but they never teach them how to manage the grant.
Yeah.
And so this is one, GITA, obviously through these you're working on that, but that's something that I think needs to go out to the grant community, our universities particularly, is that when you're developing your students, they have to learn the business of managing a grant. Because as a funder, I'm not going to give it to you if you fail.
Yeah.
Give you another one.
And if I might interject, actually, one of the things already I did was look around for a university that really is interested in grant making. And what we heard from several were, yeah, we'd like to teach people how to be more successful at receiving grants. We'd like to teach people how to be more consistent and successful about ensuring they stay in compliance and don't get their grant funding yanked. But GWU, frankly, was the only one who said, yeah, we're really interested in helping grant makers get better at managing the grants that are issued. And so to a certain extent, again, based on a sample within the Washington metro area, there hasn't been a lot of focus academically, with the exception of the Trachtenberg School and Kathy Newcomer's leadership.
Yeah. So for those who are online, just to kind of try to summarize the back and forth a little bit, is how Barbara mentioned that the focus is often at the university level is to teach researchers specifically, I think is what you meant, is how to write a grant and receive funding. Like, that's the focus, which kind of makes sense, right? Because everyone wants the funding. So really the focus is on receiving the funding, and there's no focus on actual grant making or how to best manage the award after you receive the funding. And then Jeff jumped in and mentioned they're also interested in compliance, because if you don't comply, then the funding gets yanked. So it's all very, it makes sense. It's driven by the funding, essentially, is what the focus has been. But not on how to better improve actually how you manage the grant or improve outcomes, which is something that we're very interested in, and things like that. Yep. All right, any more in workforce development? So another area that, and we've already talked a bit about this, is there's this need to better use information technology. Again, there's no standardized business process or shared solutions for federal grants management currently. Obviously, some agencies have some great systems that they share, with other agencies, but generally there's no like government-wide approach at this moment. And there's no central post-award reporting portal to interface for recipients. Again, the idea is that there's this great opportunity that if you could use information technology, you would improve data standardization, you would alleviate recipient burden, and you'd actually allow agencies to share information across portfolios to develop innovative program designs. So yes?
I know that about 10, 12 years ago when the Grants.gov vision was formulated, it was sort of slated as a possible single portal for all interactions, right from sort of cradle to grave interactions for the recipients. But I think the focus over the last decade primarily has been just find and apply. So I'm curious that does OMB see that as a possible portal where the post-award reporting activities can be consolidated?
Okay, so the question was that when Grants.gov was created, it's over a decade ago now, that the idea was that eventually it could possibly be a place where you do everything from cradle to grave grants management. And now the focus has been largely on find and apply, which is true. So Grants.gov remains the find and apply system. I can't comment to the extent like Grants.gov would be the future potential area portal that you go into. It could certainly be leveraged because it already exists and recipients are already registered, most of them. So, I mean, yeah, and another government-wide system that every recipient uses as well is SAM.gov, System for Award Management, which is managed by Integrated Award Environment. So that's another potential area. There's also, so I mean, but I can't comment to the extent that, like which system or what future system could be leveraged for this purpose.
But is there a desire from a policy perspective to move in that direction, regardless of whatever the system is? I mean, the second point in terms of the challenge.
Yeah, I think that there's definitely interest, and and whether one system could accomplish this for every type of grant is also a question that remains, because like there's very unique programs. Like if the research community, they have their kind of own needs, or you have the non-discretionary grants that go to the states. Like the management of those type of awards are different. So it would be great if in the future we could say there's one place that you could go, but to the extent that every agency or every program would be able to use one source, I mean, that hasn't been explored. Yeah. Any more on information technology, potential areas you all see? All right, so, I thought I skipped one. Also, this continued focus on performance over compliance. I think you probably heard me say it several times, how the focus is on better outcomes. Again, there's this opportunity that if we actually focus on performance over compliance, that we'd actually be reducing burden. We wouldn't be so focused on, you must submit this report because you've always submitted this report, right? Like this perspective. Well, you have to do this because your terms of, but it just more, let's focus on the program outcomes and how we could, not collect information just to collect information, but really focus on the outcome of the award. It would reduce burden. It would allow recipients to innovate and course correct. We've actually heard from the recipient community, and again, a lot of this may have to do with statutory requirements associated with specific programs, but that sometimes their grants are structured in such a way that they're actually not allowed, like they're often doing the same thing year after year without the opportunity to actually change course correct, and they know that maybe another intervention or strategy would be better, they would have a better outcome. Like we've heard that from the recipient community. I don't know to the extent that that's actually true, but we've heard that from the recipients. So we do need as a grants community to look more, let's not focus on how we've been doing business, but how we can just focus on better outcomes for the awards. Any more on this? Any comments? All right, so I'm coming towards the end of the presentation. Yeah. So again, there's a lot of great resources out there. Please check out the COFAR website. And again, here's a list of all the stuff you can find on there. And there's a lot of great resources of other organizations as well. And there is my contact information if you have any follow-up questions. Or if you have any questions now or comments.
Okay, I just had one related question to the last slide. So in terms of this focus over outcomes, I know that the Transparency Act, I think one of the whole idea was to create transparency and promote accountability. So is there some plan of trying to create a place where the results from all the grant programs across the government can be made available to citizens so they can take a look at how much was spent and what outcomes were delivered?
Yeah, so I mean, the question from the audience was, so we have the Data Act, which focuses on federal spending transparency. Is there any effort to actually go even further and say, okay, this is where the spending went, but here's the actual outcomes from that spending? No specific initiatives at this particular moment, but that's an idea that we've heard, that like the Data Act, you know, federal spending could be the first step, and then perhaps you could get to a future state where you actually see the actual outcomes of performance of that funding. Yeah. Anything else?
Just for clarity, your boss, the comptroller, Dave Mader, is a political appointee and will be leaving with the administration, but I assume you might continue to stay on and that folks in the room could contact you if they have a question now or 6 months from now?
Yeah, I am a civil servant. I'm not going anywhere.
Are you open to folks, for example, from federal agencies in the room contacting you if they have questions or would like to follow up?
Yeah, absolutely. Yep.
We do anyway, so.
Yeah, I was going to say, many of you in the room I know because you often contact me with questions and comments. It's not a shy group.
I would like to, on behalf of GW and REI, thank you very much for being here. Thank you. You will join us again on November 10th. I guarantee it won't be really hot in the room. So that's and we will know who the new president is, and so there'll be a little bit more certainty and maybe you know, be able to provide a sort of a uniform voice on where we should be going. So thank you for coming, everyone.
Oh, okay.
That was really perfect. Yeah.